Life used to be simple. Back in the early days of digital, we could simply set a cookie on your browser, and that cookie allowed us to identify who you are. Not who you are as a person, but your behaviors, the ads you click on, the content you read online. And we could inform that cookie with all sorts of information. And when you went from one website to another, we still knew who you were, or we knew what your behaviors were. And when we wanted to append information to that cookie, we could do that, either through a third party or other partners. We could enrich that cookie with information. And we wanted to share information across ad servers or ad networks or programmatic companies. That was easy too. We did that through a cookie sync. But the world has gotten very, very complicated. And the cookie, the power of the cookie, the simplicity of the cookie, is actually a liability now, because there's a massive proliferation of channels and devices. And it's getting harder to identify users using a cookie, which leads us to the universal ID. I'm going to invite up our panel, and we're going to get to the bottom of this. All of these gentlemen are prominent in this industry in helping to solve the problem of the universal ID. How do we evolve beyond the cookie? How do we use a unique identifier that is both privacy compliant, but gives us the ability to enrich a profile about a user so that we can make advertising more engaging, more welcome, and better measure advertising? So without further ado, number one is Ari from Tapad. Serge from comScore. Gary from Wunderman and KBM. And Amit from Adobe. Guys, just to kick off, all of you are leaders in this field, and first I just want to give the crowd an idea of what your company is doing to further the development of the concept of a universal ID. So Ari, let's start with you.
Yeah, so we typically work with a lot of people in the industry to provide them with a unified identifier across all of the different devices, actually providing some of the solutions. So we work probably with the majority of I think all of the DMPs, majority of the DSPs, most of the ad networks, like the majority of the companies out there, to help with unification across multiple screens. So that's unifying a cookie to an IDFA, to an Android identifier, and all kinds of touch points that a consumer has.
Good. Serge.
Yeah, for us, well, actually two things. So for us on digital, we obviously have access to census-based tracking on every single device, on PCs, on mobile. We see the IDs, we unify the IDs. We have our own ID. We have, we can see IDFA, we can see ad ID, we see all of that stuff. But what's even more exciting is the merger between us and Rentrack, where we're able to unify that data at an individual ID level. Now, the reporting may be some sort of aggregation, but at an individual ID level to include to include cross-platform. So at scale, and that for us is the future.
Gary.
Our business is started old school, and so when everything was offline, and the business was called ID management, and the idea of collecting and managing the various assets and data that people have through the various channels in which they were found, and bringing all of that together. Today, we collect and manage over 900 million profiles, where we know anywhere from 50 to 1,000 things about the individuals associated with those profiles, and delivering them to CRM and online applications every day.
Amit?
Yeah, I think a lot of what, excuse me, a lot of what these guys are doing, we're doing as well. The reason we're approaching it a little differently is we're approaching it from a marketing cloud point of view, right? So I think from an Adobe point of view, what we're trying to do is create a full integrated stack of marketing applications, right, for paid, earned, and owned, whatever your application is. And effectively to do that, we're trying to solve this universal ID concept to be able to propagate across all those applications.
So if the problem is, and this question is for you, Ari, if the problem is identifying a user across multiple channels and devices, which channels and devices can we currently, today, reliably target a user? knowing that it's the same user across those channels and devices?
Yeah, so now we do this kind of easily to get together with partners between phones. There might be 10 different identifiers for one person on one phone, right? So that's the first problem. You have to unify those first. And on tablets and on computers. But we're now also actually seeing a lot of companies that we work with in the location space, for instance, that are starting to pull location data in. So like the Place IQs of the world and these type of companies that we work with, Ninth Decimal, that's pulling that type of data in. So now we're starting to get touch points for consumers out in stores as well. And then I think television. So television is just now coming into kind of our technology and our systems as well, where we can start tying televisions in. But the ones that you can really do this on a huge scale and huge amount of accuracy is phone, tablets, and computers.
Serge, so Ari mentioned television. You know, one of the benefits of a true universal ID is targeting, but potentially a bigger ramification of the universal ID is measurement, which is obviously your business. So can you talk about the impact of a universal ID on measurement, what that means for Nielsen, comScore, traditional measurement metrics, and also how far along are we in TV?
Yeah, and I think for us, it's all about scale. It's all about, so bringing an ID together that links linear TV, VOD, OTT, to any of the mobile devices, to PC together, and then using it for targeting purposes, leveraging it into the Adobe DMP or whoever else, and then using it for that's the vision. That's the vision that we did the Rentrack merger. Now we're putting all of those assets together. We're talking about, on digital, it's everybody. There's no one that we don't have, period, on both PCs and on mobile screens. On TV, we're talking about 40 million or so TV screens that we're actually able to do this. So for us, the reason why this universal ID is so important is when you link it together, you can then actually not only provide the media planning tools for in terms of reach and frequency, both at a national and local level, but you can also start using it for, hey, I want to go and target F-150 buyers that are 18 to 34-year-olds and like Donald Trump. How do I go? Where do I go find that? Across all screens. That's once you have that with the universal ID and you can link it all together, it's pretty powerful.
So I think that's a really good vision of the future. Not necessarily, I mean, we're getting there, right?
We're getting there. I think it's actually not that far off. I think I think within a couple of, I'm hopeful in 2016 that will happen. It's not that off. A lot of this plumbing, working with KBM, a lot of working with Videology, with Zach, there's a lot of this plumbing that's already happened. It's putting all the pieces together.
So Gary, I want to bring that back to, you work with clients every day. You come out of the traditional data management business, the offline big data business, before it was called big data. And you're now transitioning KBM and Wunderman to be, a much more modern version of that. But where are clients right now? What are the basic problems clients are trying to solve right now today with the universal ID?
Well, it's interesting, and there was a comment in the previous panel about that there were client had 100 replications of one of their customers in 100 different silos, and we still find today that customers are still very nascent in a journey on aggregating the information that they have in their enterprise and bringing it together so that consumers, so that they can act on it for the benefit of their customers. In fact, the consumer is farther ahead, much farther ahead than the brands typically are, because they expect a different experience. They expect a connected experience. They expect the fact that when they start a purchase transaction on their mobile phone and the font is too small, that they go to their tablet and they can complete that. And they expect to pick up where they left off. They expect that when they are recognized upstairs in the airport for their loyalty to the airline, that they're equally recognized and apologized appropriately when the airline loses their luggage downstairs. And that journey is very nascent for some brands. At the same time, there are many companies, with some of the things that we're talking about today, they're rather far along in that, in delivering a very integrated, personalized, customized experience where the conversation isn't about how they collect and connect this information. It's how do you create the content that drives that personalized experience, because that's almost the last mile and some of the most difficult pieces, because the math and the analytics are there. a little bit ahead of the messaging.
So are you saying that, you know, for your clients, the customer relationship management or the customer experience management is more important or as important as the acquisition activity of media and advertising? And are those sort of, is there a walled garden between those right now?
We're finding more and more that there is not. So as companies come together and integrate those silos are necessarily bringing together that acquisition, if you will, and that retention capability. And you know, dare I say, executives are meeting in the conference room and shaking hands for the first time, you know, where they had separate responsibilities in those areas, but they're now one and the same because they're solving the same problem.
Yeah. Amit, you're a product guy, so I'm going to ask you this question. Can you, at a very high level, explain the technology behind how we join up all of these various IDs?
Yeah.
And please, can we hear the answer to what is the difference between deterministic and probabilistic? Because I think that's one of those things when you want to sound smart in this conversation, you sort of throw it in. But if you could please straighten out for us what it means.
I was going to use that to sound smart, Brian. So thank you. No, it actually is kind of funny because I think people, no offense to our broader industry, we like to throw around words that we think we sound smarter. I think we're a little bit like lawyers that way, where it's actually very, very simple concepts. Look, and Ari can speak very well to probabilistic. It's pretty simple, right? There's a world of deterministic linkage, right? A world of deterministic linkage basically means I know who you are, right? I knew that through an authentication event, right? And that's why when you hear the word deterministic, you'll typically think about, well, who has a big reach? You'll think about Facebook, right? You'll think about these kind of guys, people that have that authenticated login, right, to actually know who you are across these different devices. That's what we call a deterministic. Probabilistic, very simply, is saying, hey, based on what signals I'm seeing and based on a certain inference and probability, I think that's you, right? It's very, very simple, right? So there's algorithms, there's math, there's people a lot smarter than me writing those math, but effectively what they're trying to do is say, hey, I want to be able to know that's you. I don't know that's you, but based on the signals. And I think one of the misconceptions that I see, Brian, in the industry is that people like to say probabilistic versus deterministic. It's not a verse, right? They have to coexist. Right. In fact, the way we look at it is probabilistic should be trained by deterministic. You're never going to get to full reach deterministically, right? So the whole goal, and I think where Adobe's kind of really coming at is how do you create the richest deterministic base to drive that accuracy, but then you use that probabilistic inference to drive the reach. So in very simple terms, that's what it means.
So follow-up question, and I want to get all your opinions on this, but you know, if deterministic is we've seen you before, we know who you are, and probabilistic is we think we know who you are, which I think is a good way of thinking about it, then don't Facebook, you know, companies like Facebook and first-party advertisers and marketers have an advantage in building a universal ID? And why do we need all of these other companies in the ecosystem like Tapad? And I want to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think Ari would be great to weigh in. So a couple of comments on that. Number one is the answer is yes, right? I think if you're looking at a deterministic footprint, there's no question that if Facebook, right, to some extent Google, a lot of people don't talk about Amazon, right? Look at these companies that have these massive authenticated logins, they have an advantage. Here's the thing though, right? From an Adobe point of view, we talk to the ecosystem about, it's great to have a singular identity in the walled garden, right? The way, at the end of the day, to be valuable to an advertiser, that cannot exist within a single environment. It's that simple, right? So in our world, what we're trying to do at the Marketing Cloud level is how do we create, we call it the open platform for identity. How do we bridge that identity across all these different platforms? And that's for marketers what we're hearing they need, right? And not just having Facebook own that singularly.
So I actually agree and disagree with Amit. It's, Facebook has an advantage, no doubt about it, but at the end of the day, from our measurement perspective, it goes back to the same old concept is you can't grade your own homework. Sure. So you need an independent measurement system, you need independence, and you know what, as far as we're concerned, these walled gardens are going to exist, they're going to coexist. I'm actually not that optimistic that you're going to have a universal ID as long as you have the Googles and the Facebooks of the world and not connecting with each other. So for that, this is where the independent third-party measurement systems actually work and benefit our clients. And
I'm going to give you a chance, Gary, in a minute. But Ari, why do we need, if we have deterministic, why do we need companies like Tapad to help us connect the dots?
Yeah, no, so we do both. We do both deterministic and probabilistic, and that's what we've seen as well, is that you have to have this combined approach. So if you just think about, don't think about it from a technology perspective. Think about it from your day perspective. Everything that you do in a day. How many of those activities are you actually logged in? Are you logged in when you go to a store? Probably not. Are you logged in when you sit in front of your television? Probably not, right? So most of the touch points that you have with a consumer throughout the day, you're actually not in that logged in experience. As a marketer, and marketers that want to either target or collect or figure out a way to reach a consumer on all those different touch points, you have to have a combined approach. And that's when this stuff starts to get really complicated, because that's when you need to have an underlying technology that can manage identity across all of these different types of touch points. So imagine if you have on this one consumer now 300, 400, 500 different identifiers, right? So your normal kind of a cookie store type of technology just going to break down. And a lot of people try to solve that by creating these deterministic links between one cookie and one IDFA. And that doesn't cut it when you're going to have to put together like 300 different identifiers. So it's important to think about what type of technology you need in order to solve that consumer problem.
Right. So Gary, coming back to you, advertisers sit on a tremendous amount of data. Certain types of advertisers sit on a tremendous amount of data, and of course, that's been in the realm of companies like KBM. What is the role of agencies in helping advertisers connect the data to this broader ecosystem and amplify that data and make it sort of make it actionable in a media environment?
Well, I think there's maybe two parts to your question. One of the roles that we have is to identify the right set of data. And in building off of what was just said around walled gardens and where some of the best, maybe deterministic might happen, life happens outside of those walled gardens. And so, from that standpoint, our job is to identify data from everywhere and to bring all of that together, but to understand what is the right data. What we found quite a bit of is we have so much data today, but we don't have the analytics in some cases yet to keep up with that proliferation of data, in that we're not finding some of the incremental signal that we think we're going to get by having all of that data. So often what we want to do is take a step back and say, what is the most productive data for where we are right now to generate that response or that activity that we need to have, and really look at our job being to identify those sources and those touch points that are really going to drive that activity, as opposed to throwing it all together and saying it all must be valuable. And we're finding that today that's not necessarily the case.
Amit, it sounds to me like there's several ways to get at this. There's several solutions providers that will provide you with a quote unquote universal ID. Does that then introduce the concept of a meta universal ID? And where does it end? How many of these standards will exist when all of this shakes out in the end?
Yeah, it's like that Chinese doll thing, right? Like you keep stacking them up or whatever it is. Yeah, I mean, I think, Brian, to be frank, I think it's not the news I probably want to deliver, but I think that is right? I think at the end of the day, you're going to have, I think there's a short-term, medium-term, long-term is the way I look at it, right? I think short-term, medium-term, you're going to see a few vendors emerge. Some of them are walled gardens. Some of them are more software platforms, right? You're going to see a bunch of people come out and say, hey, we have the graph, if you will. And I think, by the way, I think one misconception also is that cross-device is not the full graph, right? We can talk about that later if we want to. But so I think you're going to see that in short-term. My gut tells me, and if you look over time, I think you're going to see that consolidate. Right, I think over time what you're going to see, you're probably still going to have some of the walled gardens saying, hey, we are the single source of truth. But I think over time what you're going to see is as marketers and advertisers really want to standardize on that one notion of, hey, I need this at scale, right? And I want this to be applicable across all these different environments. I'm going to start standardizing. And who that is obviously up for debate. I have my opinion, but I think that's the way it's going to kind of play out over time.
Serge, let's say we reach this utopian environment of one standard or multiple standards of universal ID, and we can now determine that a person saw an ad on a website and then saw an ad on their mobile device and saw an ad on their TV in their living room. How will that change the measurement business? How does your deal with RenTrack? How will that change the measurement business, and what effect will that have on companies like Nielsen?
Well, I think the way it works, it will help us, no doubt about it, to provide the data at scale. I think at the end of the day, like there's the folks here from Mars, what do they care about at the end of the day? At the end of the day, what they really care about is, does this ad actually drive sales? And did this ad drive sales? Not, and we don't want to find out about it 6 to 8 to 10 weeks after the end of the campaign. We want to know about it during the campaign. And having that ability to do that so you can do the measurement and the optimization in flight of a campaign, that's where really this all has to go to. How does this work with, how does this affect companies like Nielsen? You know, respectfully, you have to ask them, but we look at them from a panel-based. I think we're really coming at it from two different ways of attacking it. They're coming at it from a panel, a small little panel on TV, even though it's the currency, and linking it all together. But it's really from a targeting perspective, you can't do it that way. You just really can't. You're limited to the size of what you're starting off with. So that's the reason why the Rentrack merger makes a whole lot of sense, is because you're bringing scale. You're bringing everything together and then linking it to the advanced demographics, linking it to the offline sales.
So Ari, you mentioned earlier that a potentially very significant application of this is geo-targeting, where, you know, basic premise is I walk into a retail store, that store knows I'm a customer of the store, and they feed me offers as I'm, you know, walking around the store. So the question is, and Gary, I want your opinion on this as well. You know, what is our responsibility as an industry as far as privacy is concerned, and how far is too far in terms of our ability to target a customer?
We had one advisor to Tapad, who was one of the executives of one of the big agencies, and he said they did this research. They asked everybody who was walking into the store what you're going to buy in the store, and they wrote down everything. And then they asked the same people walking out of the store, what did you actually buy in the store? And also 60% discrepancy between what they said they were going to buy and actually what they bought. So there's a lot of decisions that are being made in store, and it's the hardest place to kind of get to a consumer. So I think we're going to see a lot of innovation in that space. But at the same time, you need to be incredibly careful with personalized information on this. And most advertisers don't care so much about getting down to that personal person. They just want to understand that these 50,000 people or these 10,000 people or these 5,000 people actually had an effect of what the ads I showed them or the measurement systems that I have. So I don't think the ones that are kind of striving for that one-to-one within the location environment, I don't think you don't get enough scale, and you're starting to kind of borderline on some privacy issues.
I think Lester Wunderman said it best over 30 years ago when he said, don't talk to me with data you know about me just because you can. And it's very important, I think, at the end of the day, that as stewards of all of this data, we don't make consumers feel like we're creepy. And the way to do that is to provide a value exchange where the value of the services and the benefits that consumers are receiving is equitable to the information that they're providing. And studies have shown recently that the overwhelming majority of consumers are willing to provide more information in exchange for a better, more personalized, more relevant experience. And that's why we're seeing preference centers being established by brands that historically have not done so, to allow consumers to weigh in on that data exchange and provide that data so that they can have that individualized experience with a brand.
So I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but I'd love to get questions from the audience if there are questions. So if you have them, get them ready, and I'll get back to you in a couple minutes. Amit, Adobe is historically in the creative business, creative software business. So assuming now we can identify users across all of these touch points, what effect will that have on creative and the creative process?
Yeah, it's such a fantastic question, Brian. I think it's one that it's funny that we don't talk about enough, right? Because I think we spend so much time, as we should, speaking about data, right? And if you think about it, I think we're almost already there, have the ability to go to this level of mass personalization, right? Like one-to-one, right? That is the holy grail. And to me, the bottleneck is not the data, and the bottleneck is not the data management systems. The bottleneck is the content, right? And I think that's where a lot of people, we spend so much time just focusing on the data aspect. And so I think what you're asking, Brian, is that it's great for Adobe, right? Because the way we look at it is say, hey, given that pretty much every creative professional is using our tools, how do we make that more seamless? And that means really two very simple things, right? Number one is, how do you take those assets directly out of the tools and basically propagate those to any marketing channel where they can use it? And number two is, and I think, Brian, where you're going is, if you have this data science, you have the ability to go to this nth level of targeting, how do you put some data science around kind of the dynamic capabilities around that media to actually, around the content to make it scalable? So I think that's the big topic, personally, it's still coming. You're starting to hear more about video now. It's been around in the first incarnation around DCO, where I would display. I think you're starting to hear more around video, but to me, that's where it's gonna go. That's the bottleneck, right? When the data's there, it's, what do I do with it?
And Gary, you know, in terms of analytics, and there was a lot of discussion on the earlier panel about analytics, but similar question, but what will the effect of a universal ID be on attribution and the way we think about attribution? And obviously I want to get your perspective on that as well, Serge.
You know, clearly I think you would obviously say it would be better attribution, but I think even more importantly, when we think about attribution, at the end of the day, it's about we're trying to measure something so that we can ultimately get better at helping people purchase what they want. And so understanding how people are behaving in those channels is as important as anything. And I think I referenced it earlier, where for me, mobile devices are sort of research tools, and desktop and PC devices are purchase tools. But if we were to say, in that case, let's attribute all of the value of what happened to, you know, the last click, or if you will, the purchase tool, which was the PC, we would have overlooked the fact that so much of my decisioning, in fact, it was just utilitarian to push click on a bigger screen, so much of my decisioning was made a couple screens earlier with that. And I think we have to just get very thoughtful about that. Universal IDs will really help us connect that and understand the behavior, not just the presence of consumers on those devices.
No, I think it's exactly what he said, but it's also, you know, back to what I said earlier, it's just linking everything together at scale in terms of attribution for offline purchase. So linking the data to actual frequent shopper data, actual store level data, not theoretical, you can't do it based on a small sample, it has to be at scale, and you have to get partners from Kantar to Datalogix to IRI to all of these guys, linking it down to the individual ID level.
Questions from the audience? Don't be shy. John Montgomery from GroupM.
Hi, Brian, thanks. I wanted to explore the privacy thing a little bit more, in that not only do the first parties have, you know, signed on users, but they seem to be respectable because those signed-on users are all given them permission to do whatever they like with the data, right? We in this room are mostly third-party collectors, and those first-party guys are in Washington painting us as the bad guys. And I'm worried that this ain't over from a legislation perspective, and those guys are saying, you know, be careful of the third-party guys. How do we defend ourselves against the first parties from a legislative and a privacy perspective and not be the bad guys?
I'm happy to take it. So I think it's another really good point, because you're right. The Facebooks of the world, all these guys. I think the answer to me is very simple. It's education and actually lean forward. I think a lot of times this industry collectively is viewed as doing stuff, you know, I don't want to call under the table, or using data without express consent. You know, what we found is we engage very, very heavily with a lot of those standards bodies, right? And as long as we're completely upfront, right, and saying, hey, this is exactly what we're doing. Yes, we're using a lot of third-party technology underneath, but this is our plan to go above and beyond, potentially even what the first-party guys are doing, right? And we're being completely above board. We find that we're educating as much as we're advancing, but it's a challenge where I think as an industry we're all kind of facing.
Yeah, it is, because at the end of the day, if there is an education, when you start looking at scale, it's either that or you go back to panels, and then you're going back to small samples because you have to do the opt-in process and all of that. So there's a lot of education, but you also run a really fine line. There's just a couple of weeks ago, there was, whether or not it's noise or not, who knows, class action lawsuits against some smart TVs folks saying, well, we didn't know you were snooping us. So that's a concern. That's a big concern. How do you prevent that? Again, always constant reminding them. Maybe reminding them, but not doing an opt-in, but still providing an opt-out process. But it's tricky. It's very, very tricky. And yes, regulation is coming. I have no doubt that regulation is going to come down on this.
You know, we receive inbound calls from consumers one at a time, frequently, all the time. And we have a very specific methodology around how we explain the data that we have and how we've acquired it and how we and our clients are using it. And it's interesting when you actually walk through that with a consumer, and at the end of doing that, we absolutely offer someone in real time to opt out of any downstream marketing that we have associated with them for any piece of data we have throughout the world. We can do that for them. More often than not, they choose to be part of the process because they realize the value and the benefits that are provided. Once we explain what will get shut off, if you will, and what things won't occur without the use of the information.
Ari, rather than chime in on that, let me ask you the last question, which is what advice would you give to our clients in the room that are looking for a solution to the universal ID problem?
So I think every time we spend time with marketers, I'm realizing that their world is so much more complex than any vendor or any agency actually thinks it is. I have one client in Detroit, and they have 300 different IT systems and marketing systems and attribution systems and ad servers and all kinds of stuff. So it's one consumer that's going to buy a car and buy another car from them has to touch 300 different systems, right? So so I think the ability for them to actually manage identity and think about identity as an infrastructure layer versus as an identity that sits in with one of these verticals that they are working on, I think it's important. I think it's a little bit similar to what ad serving was like 15 years ago. Industry really took off when you had a common currency around something that was important for everybody involved. So I think for the big marketers, I think it's really to understand that this is an infrastructure layer challenge that's touching on a tremendous amount of different IT systems.
Good. Great way to end it. We're going to leave it there. Thank you very much to my panelists. Thank you.